To begin with, there are two types of IELTS exam. There's the general training and there's the academic. Now, we're going to focus today looking at the academic version of the IELTS exam, because that's the one that most people are sort of more interested in. The two exams are very similar. Very, very similar, actually. The big difference, so they're the same length, all the sections are the same length. They have the same structure, they use the same marking descriptors. The main difference is the part one writing. For the general training exam, it's a letter, as I'm sure many of you are aware. And for the academic, of course, it could be a process or a map or a table or a graph or something like that, or paragraphs. The other differences are there are slight differences in the part two writing topics, and the reading topics are less academic with the general training version. These are the exam details. You've got for reading, you've got 3 sections. It's an hour for the reading. For the writing, it's 2 sections. You've got an hour again. The speaking is 3 sections. It's about 11 to 14 minutes. Really, they want about 14 minutes, and most people will spend 14 minutes, but it goes very quickly. And then the listening, there are 4 sections, 40 questions, and it's 30 minutes, just half an hour for that listening. Now, I thought to include the writing marking descriptors because that's really what we're going to spend a lot of time looking at today. And so just to familiarise you, for those of you who aren't aware, or for those of you who have seen the writing marking descriptors but don't really understand them, this is a basic explanation. So for the task completion, there are 4 different parts to those writing marking descriptors. There's task completion, cohesion and coherence, lexical resource, and grammatical range and accuracy. Task completion is asking whether or not the candidate is doing the exam, is doing the task that's required. Basically, are you answering the question that they've asked? Are you completing all parts of the task? So we'll look at the individual tasks and you'll see there are a number of different parts of the task. Do your ideas all relate to the task? So this is quite an important one. Often people, when they're writing essays, for example, they will leave the topic. They'll start writing about other things which will not be on the topic, and you can lose marks for that. And do you develop your ideas, or are they very simple? And again, we'll look at that. That comes mainly in that part 2 of the writing, the essay. Cohesion and coherence. So do your ideas flow together? Are they well linked? Do you use a variety of those sort of linking words? If you are only using and, but, and so, then this is not a variety. A variety would be using more advanced linking words. And do you use paragraphs correctly with one main idea? So paragraphing comes in that cohesion and coherence section. And that means not putting many different ideas in one paragraph. Then there's lexical resource, and that just means vocabulary, really. So do you use a variety of different words, or are you just using the same words over and over? And are the words you're using accurate? And when I say the words, I mean, are they the correct words? So in other words, with the correct meaning, is the word form accurate? If you're supposed to have an adverb, are you using an adverb, or are you using an adjective or a verb or a noun? And then, of course, spelling. Spelling's a big part of it too. And then the last section there is grammatical range and accuracy. And that's just talking about how accurate your grammar is. For example, like, are your tenses accurate? Are your verb forms correct? Are you using the correct prepositions, etc.? And are you using a variety? Which is, as it says down there, do you use a variety of constructions? If you're only using the present simple or the past simple, because, for example, if it's an explanation of something or description of something, just the present simple may be correct, but you can mix it up by using passive forms as well as active forms. Yeah, so variety is quite important there, variety. So those are the writing marking descriptors. Then we move on to part one of the writing, and the writing part one task. And again, we're looking, so the writing part one task, you've got for general, you've just got a letter, but we're not really going to look at the general task today. We're going to focus on the academic. And for the academic, you've got graph or graphs, as you can see there, a map, and you've got maps there, and then you've got a process, and the process you've got a diagram of there are the B's, and those are the those along with the table of information. They are the most those are the different requirements and the tasks that you'll get one of for the part one of the academic writing. Now, to begin with, let's look at the graph. Have a look. So academic writing part one graph, the main features are important for the academic writing for the part one. The two things you really need to look at are the main features and the overview. Those are the big things. You need to make sure that that when you're explaining and describing these, that you include the main features and you include an overview. Now, the overview is probably the most commonly missed thing in the part one writing. Most commonly, if students are going to miss something that they must include, the overview is going to be it. It's not exactly explicitly clearly asked for in the task, but in the marking descriptors, if you don't have an overview, then you're not completing the task. So for the main features for these two graphs you've got here, which are traveling, you've got travel by person by car, and you've got travel per person by other forms, bus, train, bicycle, etc. So the main features, if we had a look at those two graphs, the main features for these two graphs are car travel on average is 3 times higher. So that's your overall. If you look at that average, you've got an EU average at the end of both of them. It's 3 times higher for car travel above the other forms of transport. Denmark, if you have a look at Denmark on the very left, that has the most travel of everything. So Denmark, people in Denmark are traveling the most, both by car and by other forms of transport. Other forms of transport was the least popular in France and the UK. So if you look down, you can see down the bottom there, in France and UK, that's the least popular form of, that was where the other forms of transport were least popular. The lowest car travel average is higher than the highest for other forms of transport. That's a bit confusing. But what that means is, in the car graph at the top, the lowest number was actually higher than Denmark's use of other forms of transport. And then the other main feature, the last main feature there, is that Spain has the least, people in Spain travel the least per person by car, by bus, by train, by anything. The people in Spain travel the least. Now, what I've done here is I've listed what I see as the obvious, the clear main features. When a person is doing the writing, when a person is doing this part one writing for an IELTS exam, you probably would not cover all of those. You'd probably cover 2 or 3 of those and explain them. And always, when you're describing a graph or you're describing a table, always give numbers. So if you're talking about the travel by per person by car for Denmark, you would talk about 12,000, just over 12,000 kilometers per year. If you're talking about France, you would use the number 12,000 kilometers per year. Those numbers are very helpful to support your description, and then you get extra marks for including numbers, or you get marked down if you don't include some statistics. So including numbers, including statistics for the graph is for the graphs or the tables are very important. Now I'll look at the overview there. So I've written an overview for these two graphs, and the overview would go, in a general sense, Danish people travel the most by all forms of transport, and travel by car is a lot more common than other forms of transport. So as you can see, this overview is very simple. It just includes the most obvious, the most naturally observed ideas that are coming from those from the graphs that you're given. It only needs to be one sentence, just like that. It doesn't need to be anything more. It doesn't need to be complicated. It needs to be simple and just a very general statement about all of the information you've got in the graphs. And that is the overview. But as I say, it's most commonly missed or not included by students when they are doing part 1 writing for the academic IELTS exam. Now we'll move to the next section. That was the graph. Let's have a look at the map. Now the map can be a bit confusing. If you look here, you've got 2 maps here, and what you're describing here, like the, well, slightly different actually to the graphs. With the map, you're describing the change. So you see you've got the dates there, and you've got the place name. You've got the town is called Langley, and you've got 1910 at the top for the first map, and the second map you've got 1950. So what you're describing here, and the language you're using, is to describe change. Langley in 1910 compared to Langley in 1950. Obviously, these are all past times, so your description would generally, in this case here, be using past tenses. And it's different to the graphs, because the graphs you're not actually describing change, you're just describing differences. Now here with the map, the main features is a new lane. So if you look in 1950, the new lane has been built down the bottom on the right, whereas in 1910 there wasn't a new lane. There are 2 more stores. They're Sherman Mansions and the park. They've all been added in between 1910 and 1950. We don't know when they were added, so you can't say in 1950 they were built. You can say between 1910 and 1950, the changes that happened were a new lane was built, 2 more stores, and Sherman Mansions and the park were all added. The townhouses changed to flats. So you see the townhouses on the left-hand side of Jordan Street in 1910. Those townhouses, they're actually going both sides of Jordan Street. They become flats in 1950. The factory and wasteland has been removed, and laundry and cafe, the laundry and the cafe have both been moved. So those are the main features. The main features are the differences between the 2 maps. Then an overview that I've created for this map would be to summarize the changes. There has been a general change from industry to housing with the addition of a new road and park and the removal of the factory and the wastelands. That's an overview. That's a general description of the changes. Then you would need to describe where the factory was, where the wastelands were, what happened, where the factory went, and what replaced the factory, what replaced the wasteland. These are the things that you need to explain in your description. So the overview is just a general statement, but it is just that. It's a very general statement. It doesn't explain where things are, and it doesn't explain what changes were made exactly. So with the map, it's very important to know language of places. You need to be able to talk about the east, the west, the north, the south, or you could talk about in the top left, in the bottom right, etc. But probably better is northeast, southwest, because normally with maps they give you orientation like that. They normally give you a northeast, southwest compass and show you like that. So those are the maps. And the last part one writing that we haven't looked at yet is the process. And here it is. So for the academic part one process, here you've got B's. And what's important with the process, often, very often actually, almost all the time with the process, the important thing is changing the vocabulary they give you, changing the word forms and using synonyms if possible. Now, in some cases, they won't give you, there won't be any synonyms. So, for example, if you're talking about the nouns you have there, you have bees, you have hive, you have honey. There's nothing you can really do with those. You need to include those words, but you need to make sure that you are using the correct form. So bee versus bees, you're using the plural form. You also need to have the correct verbs that go with them, collect, and then you can talk about entering the hive and placing the honey in the hive and those sorts of things. As well as that, obviously, any other vocabulary related, and we'll have a look at the main features now. So the main features for a process basically are all the steps. You need to describe all of the steps, not in so much detail. Sometimes you can leave out some of the steps if they're obvious or they're covered. By describing one step, you sometimes describe two or three. But the main features here would be, as I say, the steps. The bees leave the hive, they collect nectar, they return to the hive, they fill the cells, they fan the nectar. So that's the verb you're using for that. It says there air for step number 5. It's got the bee fanning the nectar. Then there's the evaporation of water, and then honey is produced from that process. And those are the main features. So with the process, you're basically describing those main features and trying to use synonyms where possible, and trying to make sure that you're getting the correct word forms there. And an overview for the process is a very simple thing. It's something like this. Overall, the diagram shows the steps taken by bees to make honey. It's one sentence. It's very simple. The process in some ways is easier than the map or the graph or the table, but in other ways, because of the linking, can be more challenging for candidates. The process of all of the different types of part 1 writing, the process is probably the least common. It's the one that you don't see so often. Like sometimes it's really quite rare, the process. So that's part 1 of the writing, the academic writing. Now let's move on to part 2. Well, actually, I'll give you some part 1 tips first. What the examiners want to see. So you've got to write at least 150 words. You've got to include that overview that we've discussed and looked at. A description that includes the main features. Again, those are the main features we looked at. The candidate's ability to describe changes, so changes especially for the map, and changes in terms of the different steps for the process. The candidate's ability to use synonyms, which is what I mentioned before, and the candidate's ability to appropriately link ideas together. Those are the things that examiners really want to see for writing part 1. Let's move on to the next one. So writing part 2. For writing part 2, we have you've got the essay. You've got an essay which has got various different stages, sections of the essay, and you've got a task. And let's have a look at the task first. So the task I've given, or the task that I've used here as an example, is some people feel that education should be provided only by the government and that private education should be prohibited. Now, the first thing I guess you need to understand there is, what is private education? Private education is education which you have to pay for, as compared to public education, which is education that is free. So public education is when children go to schools which are run by the government, and private education is when you have to pay a fee, you have to pay money for your students to go to those schools. And the question there is, to what extent do you agree or disagree? Write 250 to 300 words that only take 40 minutes. That would be the task. So where it says 250 to 300 words, you can write over 250 words. But normally, if a person's writing more than much more than 250 words, they probably won't have done task 1 very well, because they probably won't have enough time to do it. You've got an hour for both pieces of writing, which is divided approximately up to 40 minutes for the essay, 20 minutes for the task 1. So the first question I have for you all is, which of these must you include in your essay? The definition of education, 200 words, your opinion on education, both sides of the argument, how much you agree or disagree with the statement, and complex grammar. So which of those must you include in your essay? Yeah, you must include, exactly right, how much you agree or disagree. That's very important, because that's what the task is. To what extent do you agree? So that's how much. That means exactly the same thing. Very good. Do you need to include the definition of education, do you think, people? No, you don't. You don't need to include the definition of education. It says it doesn't ask for the definition of education. Definitely, it would be really off topic probably if you did include the definition of education. So it's definitely not needed. 200 words. Well, 200 words, yes, but you must include more than that. 250 really. Your opinion on education is not needed. Both sides of the argument. Ideally, you'd have both sides of the argument included in there in a balanced essay. How much you disagree or agree with the statement, and complex grammar. Look, complex grammar. It would be nice, but probably I would generally, depending on the band score you're going for, I would favour accurate over complexity. If you're unsure about certain structures, I wouldn't try and put them into your essay when you are unsure about if they fit in the first place, and you're unsure about how to actually use them. I would generally recommend accuracy over complexity. Now let's have a look. Writing part 2, introduction. So the structure of the introduction is you start with a general statement about the topic. a general statement about the topic, not off the topic, not so general that it's not closely related to the topic. So from the task above, you'll be looking at introducing private and public education types, like those as actual different types and options for education. Then after the second sentence would be, or the second part of this, the introduction would be linking the topic mentioned to the task. So then you want to go from private and education types to, is private education bad or is it harmful? And then to explain what you plan to do. This is the thesis statement. This is a very important sentence. It tells the reader that you have thought about your essay, that you've considered these points, and that you have some structure to your essay. And so from a reading point of view, it makes it much easier to follow your essay. So from the task above, it could be the extent you agree or disagree with the statement. That's really quite common in the introduction, but it's not necessary. You could have that in the conclusion. Some people like to include the extent that they agree or disagree with the statement in the introduction, just in case they run out of time and don't get to it in the conclusion. Yeah, that's a possibility for sure. So let's move down now. So here you go, you've got writing part 2, introduction. Here are 2 introductions. Which one is better? This is my question for you all. Which one is better and why? You've got introduction 1 and introduction 2. Have a look at them and I'll give you a couple of minutes and then we'll have a bit of a chat to see which one is better and why. Many people are saying 1 is better, and they're exactly right. 1 is better. Yeah, exactly right. 1 is better. Number 1 for sure. Yeah, exactly. It's most related to the topic. Someone's written it's most related to the topic. It's more related to the topic than number 2. Exactly right. And 2 is, well, look, to say it's off topic would not be true really, but it's not exactly on the topic all the time. And the problem is with number 2, the writer has started in a way which is too general. It's too broad. So for that introduction number 2, education is important for all people, young and old, everywhere around the world. The more you learn, the more money you can earn. Now, this is too broad. This eventually the writer does almost get to the topic, but it's too broad, it's too general, and it's not focused enough. Whereas with number 1, you've got, in most countries, people have the opportunity to use the government. People have the opportunity to use government-provided free education or private education that can be quite costly. This is introducing straight away the idea of private and public education. And then it moves into the second sentence, just as I suggested, the second sentence, just the idea that private education can be harmful or damaging. And then the last sentence is the thesis statement. The essay will look at both sides of the topic and state how much the writer agrees. That last sentence is the thesis statement. Whereas with the second paragraph, you've got this essay will discuss the idea that private education should be banned, to what extent I disagree or agree with this. That the actual thesis statement in the second introduction is fine as well. The thesis statement, in other words, the last sentence for both of those introductions is fine. But like I said, paragraph the second one, number 2, is too general and it's not focused enough. It's not on the topic enough. Now let's look at the next part of the writing, part 2, body paragraphs. So we've looked at the introductions for part 2. Now let's look at body paragraphs. So with a body paragraph, the most common way to structure them are with a topic sentence, which tells the reader which side of the argument you are about to discuss. And then you introduce your first idea, explain that first idea, and if you want, give an example. Now, the example is optional. You can include it. You don't have to. If you do have an example in those body paragraphs, it usually makes your paragraph stronger. It makes it better. And it makes it clearer. And then after idea, so idea number 1, explanation, example. Idea number 2, explanation, example. That's the structure of those body paragraphs. So let's have a look. Here is a body paragraph that I've made. It's on the same topic of public education versus private education. And I'd like you to put the sentences in the correct order to make a body paragraph. So I'll give you a couple of minutes. Put the sentences in order to make the body paragraph if you can. In the same way that I talked about, you want a topic sentence, then you want idea number 1, explanation, example. Idea number 2, explanation, example. Good luck. I'll give you a couple of minutes. So far, we've got 2 people who've replied in chat with what they think is the correct order, and actually neither of them are quite correct. Does anybody else have any idea for the correct order? I'll give you a clue, people. The first sentence is number 3. Number 3 is the first sentence. And we've just got the correct order written in the box right there as I spoke. It's exactly right. 𝐷𝐸𝐶, it's got it correct. It's 3651274. 3651274. Let's have a look. So the first sentence, we want a topic sentence, we want a general sentence, which is going to explain what the topic of the paragraph is. So what the point that we're going to discuss is. And as I said, number 3 is it. So number 3, everyone should be able to get free, high quality education. So we know from that first sentence, which is a short sentence, that the main idea of this paragraph is going to be the point of view that everybody should be able to get free, high quality education. That's our topic sentence. Now we're going to move to point number 1. So point number 1 starts with the idea. The idea number 1, which is 6. Private schools get more money so they can pay teachers more. That's our first idea. The topic itself of this paragraph is everybody should be able to get free, high quality education. So now we're arguing point number 1 against private schools. Private schools get more money so they can pay teachers more. So then we need an explanation of that, which is 5. This means that rich people are able to get a better education for their children. And then we go to an example. Number 1. Examples of this are Harrow and Eton in England. And these students are very likely to become lawyers and doctors. So there we've got a supporting example for why private school students have a clear advantage over public school students. Now we move to our second idea for the same paragraph, number 2. A second problem, excuse me, a second problem is the facilities in public schools. So we know that's our second idea because it starts with the first 3 words, a second problem. A second problem is the facilities in public schools. Explanation of this idea, we go to 7. Number 7 is the explanation of the second idea. In a public school, there is less opportunity for children to play sport or music or use the latest technology. Example of that, number 4. Whereas some private schools have their own stadiums and music studios. So there we've got an example of the advantage that the private schools have. They have their own stadiums and music studios. So that is one of our body paragraphs. That's a body paragraph. And as I said before in the previous slide, you have the topic sentence, idea 1, explanation, and an example. Idea 2, explanation, example. And now let's look at the conclusion for the writing part 2 conclusion. So the structure of the conclusion would be the summary of the main points. And if you haven't done this already in the introduction, or even if you have, you can reiterate it. That's most common in the conclusion. The state to what extent you agree or disagree with the topic, because remember that was part of the task. And those are the 2 things really you need to include in a successful conclusion. The language to start the conclusion, to sum up, in summary, to conclude, in conclusion, overall, to summarize. These are all expressions that we use to begin our conclusion. Here is a writing part 2 conclusion. I've made a conclusion for you, but I've taken some words out of it. So there are 6 gaps, and down the bottom it says put these words back in the correct gaps. Strongly, although, regardless, advantage, band, and summary. So you've got 6 gaps there and 6 words. I'll give you a minute or so. See if you can put those words back in the spaces, in the gaps, and make your own conclusion. Okay? Yeah, well done, everybody. I saw most people who responded in the chat there, they were correct. Well done. Exactly right. So it goes in summary. So number 1 is summary. Equal opportunities in education should be available to everyone. Regardless, which means it doesn't matter, it's not important of how poor or rich a person is. Although private schools offer high quality education, they take all of the best teachers and have much better facilities, giving rich children an unfair, number 4, advantage in life. I strongly agree, that's the collocation we have with agree, strongly agree, that private schools are bad for society and should be banned. Exactly right. So number 1 is summary, number 2 is regardless, 3, although, 4, advantage, 5, strongly, and 6 is banned. And as I've mentioned before, that is your conclusion, basically. It's fairly simple. You are summarizing the main ideas, which is what you can see in those first 2 sentences. And then in the final sentence, you're just telling the reader clearly what your opinion is, to what extent you agree or disagree with the task. Now, in many cases with this task 2 and also task 1, I strongly recommend synonyms. I strongly recommend not using the words that they give you in the task. If you only use the words they give you in the task, then you will find that you won't get a very high mark because your range of lexical resource, or your range of vocabulary, your variety of vocabulary is pretty low. So using synonyms is always recommended. The only case that I would suggest possibly copying the task information would be that question, that part of the task where it says to what extent. If you are unsure, I would almost always recommend including a statement like, the extent that I agree or disagree is, or I agree completely to the extent that I whatever. But including that sort of language in your part 2 essay can make it very clear for the reader that is your opinion, and that is how much you're agreeing or disagreeing. So this is the writing part to conclusion. Now let's move on to the next part. So now let's look at the speaking exam. The speaking exam, and here are the marking descriptors for the speaking exam. For the speaking exam, you've got fluency and coherence, lexical resource, grammatical range and accuracy, and pronunciation. Now, someone in the chat earlier, I noticed, asked, are the 4 areas for writing, and I guess for the same for speaking, are they all marked? Are they all given the same weighting? And the answer is yes. So fluency, coherence, 25%, lexical resource, 25%, grammar, 25%, pronunciation, 25%. So it's the same for the speaking and the writing. For each section has equal weighting. Each section has equal weighting, which is very important to understand, because you will see here that pronunciation is equally as important as grammatical range. People tend to focus both in writing, in speaking, in a lot of their studies, they tend to focus just on grammar. I've got to study grammar. I need to study grammar. My grammar's terrible. I need to make my grammar better. Realistically, for the IELTS test, grammar is as important. It's exactly the same importance for speaking as pronunciation. So if you are focusing a lot of energy on grammar and no energy on pronunciation, or no energy on fluency or lexis or vocabulary, then you're not going to end up with a very high score, because you'll get a good score for grammar, but not for the other areas. So just let's have a quick look at, I've provided you with a clearer explanation rather than the public descriptor explanation of what they actually mean and what they want. So for fluency and coherence, do you pause a lot? That's basically what they're asking. Are there lots of pauses in the middle of sentences? A pause is a space when you stop talking, and then those are pauses, and then you continue. Pauses are quite common at the start of sentences, and they're normal they happen for native speakers. They happen for everybody. When you're trying to think of an idea, you're trying to create or formulate your answer, your idea. But in the middle of a sentence, when you are halfway through a sentence and then you stop and you're thinking, which verb tense should I use here? Or what's the correct form of that word? Should it be beautiful? Should it be beautifully? In that case there, those pauses in the middle of sentences, they break up fluency and they will bring down your mark. Do you repeat words and ideas a lot? So this doesn't just mean the same word. Are you using the same word over and over again? That actually comes in the vocabulary. In this case here, some people use the same structure of the same specific things over and over again. I think. You need to get some variety, and you need to not just be repeating the same ideas. Do you use a range of linking words to join? It's the same with the writing. Are you using a range and not just and, so, but, etc.? Lexical resource. Do you use a variety of words? Same as in the writing. Are the words you use accurate? Same as in the writing. Correct meaning, word form. Grammatical range and accuracy, same as in the writing. Correct tenses, verb forms, articles. Are you using a variety of constructions? Same as the writing. But then pronunciation. Do you pronounce individual words correctly? Do your sentences have the correct stress in them? So are the sentences flat without any stress at all? Or are you stressing the correct word? Are you putting the stress on the word that has the important information? And that's what you should be doing. Pronunciation is very important. And it's an area which is most commonly not studied enough by students. So speaking parts, let's have a look. Speaking part 1, you've got short answer questions. Short personal information questions to relax the candidate. That's what happens in part 1. They're just short questions. They are quite brief. My strong recommendation there would be to everybody who is doing the IELTS exam to make sure that you can explain which country you're from, what your job is, and that you've got these very basic sentences clear and accurate before you walk into the exam. Because if you are not able to, if the most common questions are things like, where are you from? How long have you been studying English? What are your hobbies? Those sorts of things. What do you do? Do you work? Are you a student? Being able to accurately say, I am from Melbourne in Australia. My job is teaching English to whatever. These things are the most common sentences and the most common types of questions. They're very basic questions, and the idea for part 1 is just to have simple questions to relax the candidate. All you can really do if you can't get those sentences correct is give a bad impression to the examiner, and you don't want to do that from the very start. Part 2 is the individual long-term turn, shall I say, individual long-term. This is the part that scares most candidates. You're given 1 minute preparation time. You have to speak on the topic for 2 minutes. And then part 3, the extended answers. They are usually related to the topic that you've spoken about in part 2. And it's called a discussion, but it's not really a discussion. It's just you talking. It's the candidate speaking. These are my speaking tips. So part 1, short answer questions, answer in full sentences. That's simple. Practice the most basic question replies so they are perfect. That's what I was talking about before. Make sure that you've got the pronunciation right for your country. You've got the pronunciation right for your job or your university course. Make sure that you've got the pronunciation and the vocabulary right for all the most basic language surrounding you in a general sense. Individual long-term turn, use the preparation time well. Some people don't. Some people get into the IELTS speaking exam, and when it comes time to do the speaking, they just look at the task and then they say, okay, I can start. Don't do that. Take note, make notes. Even if you know you probably won't use the notes, it's always nice to have them there. It gets your mind thinking. You start to think of the different vocabulary that you're going to be using that's going to be related to the topic. Write some of that down. Write some of the words down that you think you're going to use. Then you're already starting to think about it, and it'll help greatly when you actually come to have to speak. Stop speaking until the examiner tells you to. Don't stop speaking until that examiner tells you to. Just keep on speaking. And part 3, extended answers. If you don't understand a question, ask them to repeat or to explain it. They can. Sometimes the examiners, depending on how experienced the examiners are, sometimes they aren't very good at forming questions. It sounds strange, but the examiner actually has to form the question for part 3. They're given a prompt, and they have to create their question from it as part of what they call a conversation. Sometimes those questions aren't very clear, and the examiner sometimes isn't clear about them. So you can ask for explanation of words, or you can ask them to repeat the question or to rephrase the question, because sometimes they're confusing. If you're not sure in part 3, actually if you're not sure in part 1 or 3 or any of them, you can ask them to repeat or to explain. And I would strongly recommend that if you're not sure. Now we move to reading. Tips for reading: don't waste time. Someone else in chat asked, what can I do for reading? What can I do to make the time go slower or something in reading. It's not really possible. Vocabulary is the key to improvement for reading. If you don't understand a word and you're in the middle of the reading exam, you don't understand a word, that just stops you. That just freezes you. You can't really go on. If you can't understand that word, you're stuck. So my strong recommendation there would be to make sure you're working on your vocabulary. And when I say you're working on your vocabulary, I mean when you're finding new words, you are recording, you're writing them down or making a note of them. If you've got however you're recording them somehow. You're recording the word with the different word forms, with the definition of the word, an example sentence, and the pronunciation. You need to do that for all the new words that you find. You need to review those. Reviewing vocabulary is like pronunciation. It's something that students don't do enough of. And it's something that you should be doing. Reviewing vocabulary. Review vocabulary. When you find new words, write, as I say, the word forms, the definition, an example sentence, including the word, and the pronunciation, and review them. If you don't review them, you won't remember them. And then try and use them in writing. Start to use them. It's essential. That's the difference between being able to do the reading exam successfully and not is. To become a better reader, reading practice is essential. That's my next tip, just to get used to concentrating hard for 1 hour, because concentrating hard reading for 1 hour does take some practice. People get tired, especially if you don't do much reading. People don't read anywhere near as much now as they used to. If you don't read much, and I'm not talking about reading small articles on the internet in the newspaper, I'm talking about actually sitting down with a book reading. If you don't do that, then doing a reading exam is going to be very challenging for you. The next point is you don't need to read every section. Many of the questions want you to identify specific information, not general ideas. Yeah, so depending on the question type, when it's multiple choice and things like that, you can just, you need to find keywords. So keyword identification is very important there too, and that again comes down to vocabulary. And the last point there is if you don't know the answer to a question, don't leave it blank. Have a guess. Try, have a guess. Now let's move on to listening tips. Quite similar to reading, vocabulary is very important. Vocabulary, of course, is very important, but this is where, like with the speaking, and as I mentioned before, when you are learning new words, you need to learn the pronunciation. Because if you don't know the correct pronunciation of a word when you're doing the listening, you won't know what that word is. You may have that word in your vocabulary, you may understand it, but if you have your own pronunciation version and it's not accurate with the proper native speaker pronunciation, then knowing the word is useless in listening if you don't know that pronunciation. Use the reading time well. Try to predict this is the reading time in the listening, because you have time to actually read before you have to do the listening. Try to predict the answers when you're doing a gap fill. So if you're doing a gap fill in the gap fill section, try to predict the answers. Okay, they want a number here. Looks like they want a date here. This is going to be a noun. So then when it comes to the actual listening, you're listening out for those particular types of words. If you miss an answer, don't worry, just continue on. That happens. Don't beat yourself up, just continue on. You've got to do that. And again, if you don't know the answer to a question, don't leave it blank. Have a guess. Now I'll just have a quick look in chat. The score will be deducted if we ask the examiner to repeat the question. No, so someone's asked if the score gets, if there's a deduction. No, definitely not. There's no section, there's no part of the speaking descriptors that ask about repeating a question. So there's definitely no deduction if you ask the examiner to repeat the question. They can't do anything about that. It's not a listening exam, it's a speaking exam. Someone here said, I heard some IELTS candidates said that they had faced the task which was required to write the letter to the newspaper editor. Is it possible that it happened, exception from the graphs and pictures? The letter is part of the general, it's part of the general IELTS, so it could be for the general IELTS. It's not for the academic. The academic is going to be a description of graph, process, table, or map. I'm wondering if my mixed use UK and US English can sabotage my score. Not really. No, definitely not. Actually, definitely not. You can only have problems with that if you're using both the UK and the US pronunciation for the same word. So if you are pronouncing the same word 2 or 3 different ways, if you're using UK and then US pronunciation for the same word, then the examiner is probably going to think, okay, this person doesn't, there's going to be a problem there for sure in terms of pronunciation, in terms of marking. I mean, for the individual word, it's not going to be a big thing. But basically, if you mix US and UK, that's fine. If you're pronouncing one word with US pronunciation and another word with UK, no problems at all. Not going to affect you as long as they're both accurate. Not going to affect it at all. If I write more than last question I've got here is if I write more than 250 words for task 2, would my mark be deducted? No. If you go over, no problems at all. What should be the maximum number of words that we could write without having a mark deducted? There's in the writing descriptors, there's no upper ceiling. There's no higher number. So 250 words, as long as you get to 250 words, fantastic. If you're below 250 words, you're going to start losing marks. Over 250 words, no problem. I would think if you're going to 300, 350 words, probably there's a chance you're going to be going either off topic or, like I said before, the task 1 writing is going to suffer because you probably won't have written enough for task 1, or you probably won't have included everything in task 1. You won't have enough time. But no, you can go as high as you like. Which one is better? Can I add more details except what mentioned in the original question, like in the graph that shows lists of countries, but there are not those in the original question? Can I do that? No, don't. All they want you to do is to describe the information in the graph. Don't start talking about the car usage in Australia, the car usage in Japan. No, and no. That will be off topic, and you will lose marks for that. So only describe what they've included in the graph or the table or those sorts of things. How about tricks to manage time for the writing part? It's my big problem because I always think to change the best vocabulary and grammatical range. Okay, so for managing the writing part, I would do your best to stick to the 20 minutes and the 40 minutes. And I'm not exactly sure. You always think the best. I always think it changed the best vocabulary grammatical range. I would go with what's most natural and try and work with the most natural grammar and vocabulary, the things that you're most confident with. When you're actually doing the writing exam, you don't want to be experimenting then. You want to be sure that the words and the grammar you're using are relatively accurate. This is not a time for experimentation. This is a time for you to actually get to be using the things that the structures and the words that you're confident with. Does body language impact on score? Body language in the speaking, yes and no. So there's no mark for it. There's no mark for body language. As you can see with the descriptors, you've got fluency, you've got grammar, you've got lexis, and you've got pronunciation. There's no mark for body language. But the examiner will get a good or a bad impression when you walk in there. If you walk in there looking really unhappy or doing something which is not very positive. The examiner's initial and their first impression is not going to be great. So I would not recommend that. There's no marks lost for bad body language. But if you walk in there and put your feet on the desk, then the examiner's probably going to think, then they're not going to have a great first impression. In writing task 1, can I end with a kind of conclusion? Look, you can. I would probably, you don't need a conclusion in writing task 1. The data and associated trends were perhaps driven by economic. In this case here, were perhaps driven by economic conditions in the period study. What you're doing there, unless it tells you that the data were and the trends were driven by those, what you're doing is putting your own information in there and you're going off topic. This is irrelevant information and it's not included in the topic. So I definitely wouldn't speculate. Don't guess where the information came from or guess that like that, because you're off topic. And you will, and the only thing that can happen with that is you could lose points. In speaking part 1, if I really don't understand the meaning of questions, how to ask for explaining the meaning of questions. Can you repeat the question? Or sorry, I don't understand. That's simple. Sorry, I don't understand. And the examiner will see that you don't understand, and then they'll try and explain. Or I don't understand, and then the word. I don't understand that word. I don't understand the question. I don't understand the question is probably the easiest way. And no, it won't affect the score. There's no mark down for that. Okay, what's a good way to end your answer in the speaking task? Look, there's no way. They'll cut you off anyway. So there's no problem. There's no problem there. You don't have to worry about saying thank you very much. I'm finished now, because with part 2 of the speaking, you just keep talking and they'll cut you off. Don't think that's rude. If you keep talking and they cut you off, that's a good thing. That means you've done the 2 minutes, you're finished. The examiner will be happy with that and you'll be happy with that. If I have no experience about the topic that the examiner asks, can I ask him to change the questions? Definitely not. You don't have a choice. With the topics you have to talk about them. My suggestion would be make something up. If they're asking you to talk about a job that you've had in the past or something and you've never had a job, use your imagination, make something up. It's more difficult, but what you could do is you could think about the job that my father has, and you could discuss that like it's your own job, something like that. You definitely can't change the topic. Part 3, could we choose the topic by ourselves? No, you can't. No. Yeah, part 3 of the speaking, I presume this is? No, you can't. Okay, everybody, I think that's it from me.
Thank you so much, teachers Cameron, for joining us today. That was a really nice session. Maybe we can have sessions like this in the future. Okay, so it's time to say goodbye with teachers Cameron. See you next time. Bye bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Bye.